The silence on the firing range was deafening. 23 hardened Marines stood frozen, staring at a target 800 yards away where a single bullet hole sat dead center in the bullseye. The woman who had just pulled the trigger was still lying prone. I pressed to the scope, breathing steady as a metronome. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez lowered his binoculars slowly, his weathered face betraying the first crack of disbelief he'd shown in 15 years of military service. Behind him, the whispers started like wildfire through dry grass. No way. That's impossible. She got lucky. But luck doesn't put a .308 round through a dime-sized target at nearly half a mile. Skill does. And Sarah Chun was about to prove she had more of it than anyone in Camp Pendleton had bargained for. This is the story of how a quiet librarian from small-town Oregon walked onto one of America's most elite military bases and redefined what everyone thought they knew about marksmanship, determination, and the deadly accuracy that runs in her blood. The morning mist hung low over the hills surrounding Camp Pendleton as Sarah Chun stepped out of her rental car, clutching a worn leather gun case that had belonged to her grandfather. The Marine base stretched before her like a small city, all concrete buildings and purposeful movement, so different from the quiet library where she spent her days surrounded by books and whispered conversations. At 28, Sarah had never set foot on a military installation, never fired anything more powerful than her grandfather's old hunting rifle, and certainly never imagined she'd be standing here about to challenge some of the military's finest shooters. The invitation had come 3 weeks earlier, delivered by a Marine recruiter who tracked her down after word spread about her performance at the Oregon State Shooting Championships. Sarah had won the civilian long-range category with a score that broke records going back 30 years. The recruiter, a crisp woman named Captain Williams, had been polite but direct. The Marines were hosting their annual inter-service marksmanship competition, and they wanted to include some exceptional civilian shooters to raise the stakes. Would Sarah be interested in representing civilian marksmanship against military precision? Sarah's first instinct had been to decline. She was comfortable in her small world of books, weekend hunting trips with her father, and the occasional shooting competition where she knew most of the other participants by name. But something in Captain Williams' tone suggested this wasn't just about shooting. It was about proving something, though Sarah wasn't entirely sure what. Her grandfather would have known. Chen Wei had been a sniper in the Chinese military before immigrating to America in 1962. He'd never talked much about his service, but he taught Sarah everything he knew about reading wind, calculating distance, and the meditation-like focus required for precision shooting. The rifle is honest, he used to say in his careful English. It tells only truth. No lies, no pretending. You are a good shooter or you are not. The target knows. Now, walking across the parking lot toward the base entrance, Sarah felt the weight of his old case in her hands and wondered if she'd inherited more than just his steady hands and patient temperament. The Marines at the security checkpoint were professional but curious, examining her civilian identification with the kind of attention usually reserved for dignitaries or potential threats. One young Marine, barely out of boot camp by his appearance, glanced at her gun case and then at her slight frame with barely concealed skepticism. "Ma'am, you sure you're in the right place?" he asked, not unkindly. "The competition's being held on range 400. That's where the real shooters practice." Sarah smiled, remembering her grandfather's advice about letting others underestimate you. "I think I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied, accepting her visitor's badge and walking toward the shuttle that would take her to the ranges. The ride across base gave her time to observe her new environment. Marines jogged in perfect formation along the roads, their cadence calls echoing off the buildings. Vehicles moved with purpose, and everyone she saw carried themselves with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly where you belong and what's expected of you. Sarah felt like an anthropologist studying an alien culture, trying to understand the rules of a world where precision and discipline weren't just preferred, they were mandatory for survival. Range 400 sat on a plateau overlooking the Pacific Ocean, a sprawling complex of firing positions stretching out toward targets placed at various distances. The longest range extended nearly a mile, marked by barely visible white squares that looked like postage stamps from the firing line. Sarah had shot at similar distances before, but never with an audience of skeptical Marines watching her every move. Captain Williams met her at the range office, a compact woman with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Ms. Chun, welcome to Pendleton. I hope you're ready for a challenge." "I hope I don't disappoint you," Sarah replied, though she was beginning to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake. Through the office windows, she could see Marines setting up their equipment with the kind of efficiency that spoke of countless hours of practice. Their rifles were state-of-the-art precision instruments, mounted on bipods, and fitted with scopes that probably cost more than Sarah made in a month at the library. Her grandfather's rifle, by comparison, was a relic, a 1943 Springfield 03, a for that he'd somehow managed to keep through his immigration and years of hunting in the Oregon forests. Sarah had modernized it slightly over the years, adding a decent scope and adjusting the trigger, but it was still fundamentally a 75-year-old design going up against the latest in military technology. The competition format is straightforward, Captain Williams explained, leading Sarah toward the firing line. 5 distances, starting at 300 yards and extending to 1,000 yards. Each shooter gets 3 shots at each distance. We score based on accuracy and consistency. The Marines have been practicing for months. As they walked, Sarah noticed other shooters arriving. Army marksmen in their distinctive uniforms, Navy personnel who moved with the swagger of special operations, and a few other civilians who looked far more prepared than she felt. One of the Army shooters, a tall man with multiple marksmanship badges on his chest, glanced at Sarah's vintage rifle case and chuckled to his teammate. "Looks like someone brought their grandfather's war trophy," he said, loud enough for Sarah to hear. "This should be entertaining." Sarah felt her cheeks flush, but kept walking. Her grandfather had faced worse than mocking soldiers, and he'd survived by letting his shooting speak for itself. She could do the same. The orientation briefing was held in a concrete block building that smelled of gun oil and fresh paint. 28 competitors sat in folding chairs while a range master explained the rules, safety protocols, and scoring system. Sarah found herself seated between a Marine gunnery sergeant who looked like he could bench press a car, and a Navy SEAL whose eyes never stopped moving, constantly assessing threats that didn't exist. "Ladies and gentlemen," the range master began, "you represent the finest marksmanship your respective services and communities have to offer. This competition isn't just about individual skill. It's about proving which approach to precision shooting produces the best results under pressure." He clicked through slides showing the target layouts and scoring zones. At 1,000 yards, you'll be engaging targets the size of a dinner plate in conditions that will test everything you've learned about reading wind, calculating holdover, and maintaining focus under observation. The Marines currently hold the course record with a score of 287 out of 300 possible points. Sarah did quick math in her head. That meant the Marines had averaged better than 95% accuracy across all distances, with some shots landing within inches of perfect at ranges where her target would appear smaller than her thumbnail. She began to understand why the young Marine at the gate had questioned her presence here. After the briefing, competitors were given time to inspect the ranges and get familiar with the facilities. Sarah walked the course with her rifle case, studying the terrain and wind indicators. The Pacific breeze was constant, but variable, shifting direction and intensity in patterns that would challenge even experienced shooters. At the 1,000-yard line, she set up a spotting scope and studied the distant targets, trying to imagine placing bullets in the small scoring rings from what seemed like an impossible distance. "First time at Pendleton?" a voice asked behind her. Sarah turned to see a Marine staff sergeant with laugh lines around his eyes and the relaxed confidence of someone comfortable in his expertise. His name tape read Rodriguez. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, then corrected herself. "I mean staff sergeant. Sorry, I'm still learning the protocols here." Rodriguez smiled. "Sir works fine. And don't apologize for being new. We all started somewhere. I'm curious about that rifle case, though. Mind if I ask what you're shooting?" Sarah hesitated, then decided honesty was probably her best policy. "It's a 1943 Springfield. Belonged to my grandfather. I know it's not exactly cutting-edge technology." Rodriguez's expression shifted to something approaching respect. "Your grandfather served? Chinese military, before he came to America. He taught me to shoot." "Well, that explains a few things." Rodriguez extended his hand. "Miguel Rodriguez, Marine Marksmanship Unit. I've been shooting competitively for 15 years, and I can tell you that equipment only matters if you know how to use it. Some of the best shooters I've known could put rounds on target with rifles held together with duct tape and prayer." His words were reassuring, but Sarah could see other Marines watching their conversation with interest. She had the distinct feeling she was being evaluated, measured against standards she didn't fully understand. "Can I give you some advice?" Rodriguez continued. The Marines watching you right now are wondering if you're here as a publicity stunt or if you can actually shoot. They're not being hostile. They just need to know if they should respect you as a competitor or treat you like a VIP guest. The difference will determine how they interact with you for the next 3 days. Sarah appreciated his directness. How do I earn their respect? Same way you'd earn it anywhere else. Show them what you can do. Rodriguez glanced toward the 300-yard targets. We usually start with some practice rounds this afternoon. Unofficial, just to help everyone get familiar with the range conditions. You interested? The afternoon practice session became Sarah's first real test. Word had spread about the civilian woman with the vintage rifle, and more Marines than usual found reasons to be near range 400 when Sarah began setting up her equipment. She tried to ignore the audience, focusing instead on the familiar routine her grandfather had drilled into her thousands of times. First, the rifle. Sarah opened her case to reveal the Springfield, its walnut stock worn smooth from decades of use, but the metal components maintained in perfect condition. She assembled her shooting mat, adjusted her scope settings, and loaded 5 rounds of hand-loaded ammunition that she'd prepared specifically for this rifle's preferences. Is that thing even legal for competition? Someone whispered loudly enough for Sarah to hear. Regulation allows any .30 caliber bolt-action rifle. Rodriguez answered firmly. Age isn't a factor. Sarah settled into her shooting position, forcing herself to breathe steadily and ignore the dozen pairs of eyes watching her every movement. The 300-yard target seemed manageable compared to what she'd face later, but she knew this first group of shots would set the tone for everything that followed. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. Do not shoot to impress others. Shoot to satisfy yourself. The target does not care what others think. Sarah worked the bolt smoothly, chambering her first round. Through the scope, the target's bullseye filled her field of view. She could feel the wind pushing gently from her right, maybe 3 miles per hour, not enough to require major adjustment at this distance. Her breathing slowed to the rhythm her grandfather had taught her, and, on the natural pause between breaths, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle recoiled against her shoulder with familiar authority, and Sarah immediately cycled the bolt for her second shot. She didn't look for spotters or wait for someone to call her impact. Trust the fundamentals, trust the rifle, trust the training. 4 more shots followed in smooth succession, each trigger press feeling natural and controlled. When she finally lifted her eye from the scope and looked toward the target through binoculars, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. 5 holes clustered in the center of the bullseye, none more than 2 inches from the exact center. It was good shooting by any standard, but, more importantly, it was shooting that announced she belonged here. The range had gone quiet. Rodriguez walked over to Sarah's position and extended his spotting scope toward the target. Mind if I take a look? Through his high-powered scope, the group looked even tighter. Rodriguez whistled softly. That's a 1/4-inch group at 300 yards, with a 75-year-old rifle. He raised his voice slightly, addressing the other Marines who were still watching. Gentlemen, I think we've got ourselves a legitimate competitor. As Sarah packed up her equipment, she noticed the quality of attention from the other shooters had changed. The skeptical glances had been replaced by professional interest, the kind of respect one marksman gives another regardless of background or equipment. It felt like a small victory, but Sarah knew the real test would come tomorrow when the competition officially began and the distances started to stretch toward the limits of what was possible with iron will and precise bullets. That evening, Sarah ate dinner in the base dining facility, surrounded by conversations about trajectory calculations and wind-reading techniques. She felt like she was beginning to understand the culture of military marksmanship, where precision wasn't just a skill but a philosophy, a way of approaching problems that demanded nothing less than perfection. Tomorrow would bring the real challenges, but tonight, Sarah Chun from Oregon sat among Marines and felt like she might actually belong there after all. Dawn came early at Camp Pendleton, bringing with it the nervous energy that always preceded serious competition. Sarah had barely slept, not from anxiety, but from the strange sensation of being in an environment where every sound had military precision, reveille calls, formation movements, the distant rhythm of training exercises. She'd risen before her alarm and spent an hour in meditation, a practice her grandfather had taught her was as important as physical marksmanship training. The mind must be like still water, he used to say. Ripples disturb accuracy more than wind. The dining facility buzzed with quiet conversation as competitors fueled up for the day ahead. Sarah noticed the natural segregation that had formed. Marines clustered at several tables, Army marksmen at another, Navy personnel keeping to themselves. The few civilians were scattered among the military groups or sitting alone. Sarah chose a table near the window where she could watch the morning light play across the ranges while she ate. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez appeared with his breakfast tray. "Mind if I join you? The Marines are getting a little intense over there, and I could use some normal conversation." "Of course," Sarah replied, grateful for friendly company. "Are they always this focused before competitions?" Rodriguez chuckled. "You should see them before deployment. This is relaxed." He took a bite of scrambled eggs and studied Sarah with professional interest. "You seem calm for someone about to shoot against the best marksman in the country." "My grandfather taught me that nervousness is just energy looking for direction. If I direct it toward fundamentals instead of worrying, it becomes useful." "Smart man, your grandfather. What branch did he serve in?" Sarah hesitated. She'd been vague about her grandfather's service, partly because his history was complicated and partly because she wasn't sure how current Marines would react to learning about his background. He was a sniper in the Chinese People's Liberation Army in the 1950s. He immigrated to America in 1962 and never talked much about his service, but he taught me everything I know about shooting. Rodriguez raised his eyebrows, but showed no judgment. "That explains your technique. I watched you yesterday. You shoot like someone trained in military fundamentals, but older school. Very deliberate, very patient." Most civilian competitors rush their shots. Before Sarah could respond, a commotion arose from the Marines' table. One of the younger Marines was speaking loudly enough to be heard across the room. "I'm just saying, there's a difference between shooting at paper targets and shooting under pressure. We'll see how the civilians handle it when it counts." The comment wasn't directed at Sarah specifically, but she felt the attention of the room shift in her direction. Rodriguez muttered something under his breath that she didn't catch, then spoke in a normal voice. "Johnson's a good Marine, but he's young. Hasn't learned yet that confidence and arrogance aren't the same thing." The walk to range 400 felt different than the day before. Yesterday had been about curiosity and getting familiar with the environment. Today carried the weight of formal competition, with range officials setting up electronic scoring systems and wind measurement equipment. The Pacific breeze was stronger than the previous day, and Sarah could see flags along the range dancing in patterns that would challenge even experienced wind readers. Captain Williams gathered the competitors for final instructions. "Gentlemen and ladies, today we begin with the 300-yard stage and work our way back to 1,000 yards. Each shooter will have exactly 20 minutes at each distance to fire 3 shots for score. Weather conditions are forecasted to remain stable, but watch your wind flags carefully. Questions?" A Navy petty officer raised his hand. "Ma'am, what's the tie-breaking procedure if multiple shooters achieve perfect scores?" "Smallest group size wins ties, measured center to center of the 3 shots. If that's still tied, we'll have a sudden death shoot-off at 1,000 yards. Williams smiled grimly. "Though based on current wind conditions, I doubt perfect scores will be an issue today." The competitors drew numbers for shooting order. Sarah pulled number 14, putting her in the middle of the pack. She was relieved not to be first, which would have meant shooting before the wind patterns were established, but also not last, when fatigue and pressure might affect her performance. The first Marines began their 300-yard stage with the mechanical precision Sarah had come to expect from them. Their equipment setup was identical down to the smallest detail. Same rifles, same scopes, same shooting mats arranged in precisely the same configuration. When they shot, their movements were economical and confident, the product of thousands of hours of identical training. Sarah watched their technique carefully, noting how they adjusted for wind and managed their breathing. The Marines were good, very good. Their groups were consistently tight, and their scores reflected the kind of accuracy that came from treating marksmanship as a life-or-death skill rather than a hobby. When her turn came, Sarah felt the familiar calm that always descended when she actually began shooting. The background noise faded, the wind became something she could read rather than fight, and the rifle in her hands felt like a natural extension of her body. She'd been shooting this Springfield for 8 years, and it held no surprises for her. Her first shot at 300 yards felt perfect from the moment she squeezed the trigger. The recoil was exactly what she expected, and she knew without looking at the target that the bullet had gone where she'd aimed. Her second and third shots followed with the same confidence, each one feeling like the logical conclusion of careful preparation rather than luck or hope. The scoring announcement came over the range speakers. Shooter 14, Chun. 3 shots, all X-ring. Score, 30 out of 30 possible. Perfect. But, more importantly, Her group size was excellent. All 3 holes could be covered with a quarter. Sarah packed her equipment methodically, aware that other competitors were watching her differently now. Yesterday's practice round had proven she could shoot. Today's performance proved she could shoot under pressure. The 500-yard stage brought increased difficulty as the wind became more of a factor and the targets appeared noticeably smaller through the scope. Sarah watched the Marines continue their systematic destruction of the targets, but she also noticed that the increased distance was beginning to separate the exceptional shooters from the merely very good ones. When her turn came at 500 yards, Sarah took extra time studying the wind flags and mirage patterns. Her grandfather had taught her to read atmospheric conditions like a language, understanding that bullets didn't travel through empty space, but through air that could push them off course in subtle but critical ways. The first shot felt good, but not perfect. Through her spotting scope, Sarah could see it had landed just outside the X-ring, still well within the scoring area, but not the perfection she was capable of. She made a small adjustment for her second shot, trusting her read of the wind pattern rather than overcorrecting based on one data point. The second shot landed exactly where she'd aimed, dead center in the X-ring. Her third shot followed the same path, and Sarah knew she'd recovered well from the minor mistake on her opening shot. Shooter 14, Chun. Score, 29 out of 30 possible. 2 X's and a 9. Still excellent shooting, but Sarah felt the slight disappointment that came with knowing she was capable of better. In competition, especially against shooters of this caliber, single points could determine winners and losers. During the break before the 600-yard stage, Rodriguez approached Sarah near the equipment tables. Solid shooting out there. That recovery on shots 2 and 3 at 500 yards showed real composure. Thank you. I'm actually disappointed in that first shot. I think I got impatient with the wind. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. Good shooters are never satisfied with anything less than their best. But don't let perfectionism mess with your head. You're shooting well, and the other competitors have noticed. He was right. Sarah could feel the shift in how other shooters interacted with her. The polite but dismissive attitude had been replaced by the professional respect accorded to legitimate competitors. Conversations now included her naturally, and when Marines discussed wind conditions or target strategies, they spoke to her as an equal rather than an outsider. The 600-yard stage proved to be the most challenging yet. The distance made reading mirage conditions critical, and the wind had become gusty and variable. Sarah watched several excellent shooters struggle with conditions that changed between shots, their carefully calculated adjustments becoming obsolete as soon as they squeezed their triggers. She decided to take a different approach, waiting for consistent wind conditions rather than trying to calculate adjustments for constantly changing variables. It meant using more of her allotted time, but her grandfather had always taught patience over speed. When the wind settled into a steady pattern from the west, Sarah fired all 3 shots in quick succession, trusting that consistent conditions would reward consistent technique. The strategy paid off. All 3 shots landed in the X-ring, clustered in a group small enough to be covered by a dime. Shooter 14, Chun. 3 X's. Score, 30 out of 30 possible. The announcement drew attention from across the range. Perfect scores at 600 yards in variable wind conditions were rare, even among Marines, and Sarah's total score was beginning to put her in contention for the overall competition win. As the day progressed, the competition began to take on a different character. What had started as a showcase for military marksmanship was becoming a genuine contest between different approaches to precision shooting. The Marines' systematic, equipment-driven methodology was being challenged by Sarah's more intuitive, experience-based approach. Captain Williams approached Sarah during the afternoon break, her expression thoughtful. "Miss Chun, I have to admit I'm impressed. Your shooting today has been exceptional, but more than that, you're demonstrating something we don't see often in military marksmanship." "What's that, ma'am?" "Adaptability. Our Marines are trained to a very high standard, but they're trained to shoot a specific way with specific equipment under specific conditions. You're problem-solving in real time, adjusting your technique based on what the environment is telling you rather than what your training manual says you should do." Sarah considered this. "My grandfather used to say that the rifle and target have a conversation, and the shooter is just translating between them. Every shot teaches you something if you're willing to listen." "That's a philosophy worth considering," Williams replied. "Tomorrow we move to the long-range stages, 800 and 1,000 yards. That's where the real separation happens between good shooters and exceptional ones." That evening, Sarah called her father from her base lodging to give him an update on the competition. She could hear the pride in his voice as she described her performance, but also something else, a wistful note that suggested he was thinking of his own father. He would be proud of you, her father said quietly. Not just because you're shooting well, but because you're representing something he believed in. The idea that skill and character matter more than circumstances or background. After hanging up, Sarah cleaned her rifle with the methodical care her grandfather had taught her, running patches through the bore until they came out spotless, checking every screw and adjustment for consistency. Tomorrow would bring the longest shots of the competition, distances where minor equipment failures or technique flaws would be magnified into missing the target entirely. As she worked, Sarah reflected on the day's events. She was holding her own against some of the finest marksmen in the country, but, more than that, she was proving something about the value of different approaches to precision shooting. The Marines' way worked for them, disciplined and systematic and effective. But there was room in marksmanship for other approaches, other philosophies, other ways of understanding the relationship between shooter and target. Tomorrow would determine whether that philosophy could triumph at the distances where shooting became more art than science, where the tiniest variables could mean the difference between victory and failure. Sarah fell asleep thinking about 1,000-yard shots, and her grandfather's hands guiding hers on a rifle stock worn smooth by generations of practice. The third day of competition dawned with an unusual stillness. The Pacific breeze that had dominated the previous days had settled into barely perceptible movements, creating what experienced shooters called perfect glass conditions, atmospheric stability that could make the difference between good shooting and legendary shooting. Sarah stood at her barracks window, watching the range flags hang almost motionless, and felt the familiar tightening in her stomach that came before critical moments. Today would bring the 800-yard stage, followed by the final 1,000-yard challenge that would determine the competition winner. After 2 days of shooting, Sarah was tied for second place with Gunnery Sergeant Peterson, a Marine with 15 years of competitive shooting experience. Leading them both by a single point was Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, whose consistent performance had established him as the man to beat. The breakfast conversation was more subdued than previous days. Shooters who had struggled with the windy conditions were hoping for redemption in the stable air, while those who had performed well were quietly confident about maintaining their leads. Sarah noticed that the casual conversation between military branches had increased. Shared respect for marksmanship was overcoming service rivalries as the competition progressed. "Sleep well?" Rodriguez asked as he joined Sarah at her usual table by the window. "Better than I expected," she replied honestly, "though I kept thinking about 1,000-yard shots. That's a long way to send a bullet." Rodriguez chuckled. "It's funny how distance plays with your mind. Technically, the fundamentals are the same whether you're shooting 100 yards or 1,000 yards. But, psychologically, there's something about watching a bullet take a full second and a half to reach the target that makes you second-guess everything you know." As they talked, Sarah noticed other competitors glancing in their direction with expressions that had evolved over the past 3 days. The initial skepticism about the civilian woman with the old rifle had transformed into professional interest, then grudging respect, and now something approaching wariness. She was no longer the feel-good story about an amateur challenging the professionals. She was a legitimate threat to win the entire competition. The walk to range 400 felt different in the still air. Without wind to read and calculate, shooters would have to rely purely on their fundamental skills and equipment precision. It was the kind of conditions where small advantages in rifle accuracy or shooter technique would be magnified across the longer distances. Captain Williams gathered the competitors for the day's briefing with an unusual solemnity. "Gentlemen and ladies, today we conclude what has been one of the most competitive inter-service marksmanship championships in recent memory. Current scores are separated by margins that can be overcome with a single exceptional stage, which means today's performance will determine our winners." She clicked through slides showing the current standings. Sarah could see her name in second place, tied with Peterson at 148 points out of 150 possible through 5 stages. Rodriguez led with 149 points, meaning any of the 3 leaders could win with a strong performance in the final 2 stages. Weather conditions are forecast to remain stable throughout the day. Wind is currently less than 2 miles per hour from the southwest. Temperature is 72 degrees with 45% humidity. These are conditions that favor pure shooting skill over environmental reading ability. The implication was clear. Today would separate the truly exceptional marksmen from those who had benefited from their ability to read and adjust for difficult conditions. Sarah felt a moment of uncertainty. Her strength had always been adaptability and environmental reading, skills her grandfather had emphasized because they mattered in hunting and field conditions. In perfect laboratory conditions, would her vintage rifle and unconventional training be enough against marine precision? The 800-yard stage began with the same systematic efficiency that had characterized the entire competition. Shooters were called to the line in score order, meaning Rodriguez would shoot first, followed by Sarah and Peterson. It was an advantage for the leaders, who could shoot in the most stable conditions, but also additional pressure since their performance would set the standard for everyone following. Sarah watched Rodriguez through her spotting scope as he took his position 800 yards from a target that appeared smaller than a postage stamp to the naked eye. His setup was flawless, rifle positioned precisely, scope adjustments checked twice, breathing controlled and steady. When he fired his first shot, the sound reached Sarah a fraction of a second after she saw the muzzle flash, a reminder of the distance the bullets would travel. Through the high-powered spotting scopes set up for competitors, Sarah could see Rodriguez's first shot land just outside the X-ring at 10 o'clock. Excellent shooting, but not perfect. His second shot corrected slightly and landed dead center, followed by a third shot that mirrored the second. 2 X's and a high-scoring 9, solid shooting that would be difficult to beat. Rodriguez, 29 points, came the announcement over the range speakers. When Sarah's turn came, she felt the familiar sensation of the world narrowing to just herself, her rifle, and the distant target. At 800 yards, even her excellent scope made the bullseye appear smaller than a dime, and she knew that any technical flaw in her shooting would be magnified into a clear miss. She chambered her first round with deliberate care, settled into her shooting position, and began the breathing pattern her grandfather had drilled into her thousands of times. Through the scope, the target wavered slightly with her heartbeat, a reminder that perfect stability was impossible and that timing was everything in precision shooting. Her first shot surprised her with its perfection. The trigger broke cleanly, the rifle recoiled straight back without disturbing her sight picture, and she knew instinctively that the bullet was going exactly where she'd aimed. Her second and third shots followed with the same confidence, each one feeling like the natural result of careful preparation. Chun, 30 points. 3 X's. Perfect shooting at 800 yards. Sarah felt a quiet satisfaction, but also an increased awareness of the pressure building for the final stage. Peterson followed with his own excellent performance, 29 points with a group that could be covered by a quarter. During the break before the 1,000-yard finale, Sarah walked the range perimeter to clear her head and manage the adrenaline building in her system. The final stage would determine not just the competition winner, but something larger about the legitimacy of different approaches to marksmanship. She represented more than just herself now. She carried the hopes of civilian shooters everywhere who believed that dedication and skill mattered more than institutional training. The 1,000-yard range was imposing in its scale. The target sat nearly 3/5 of a mile away, appearing as tiny white squares against the brown hillside. At that distance, bullets took nearly a second and a half to reach their target, time enough for minor wind changes or technique flaws to push shots completely off target. Sarah set up her equipment with extra care, checking every adjustment twice and testing her shooting position for maximum stability. Her grandfather's Springfield had never let her down, but 1,000-yard shooting demanded perfection from both rifle and shooter. She loaded 3 rounds of her most carefully prepared ammunition, cartridges she'd hand-loaded specifically for this rifle's preferences. Rodriguez shot first again, and Sarah watched through her spotting scope as his bullets impacted the distant target. His first shot landed in the 9 ring at 8 o'clock, still excellent shooting, but not perfect. His second shot moved closer to center, and his third landed in the X ring. 2 9s and an X for 28 points. The announcement created a stir among the spectators who had gathered to watch the finale. Rodriguez had shot well, but his score was beatable. The pressure was now on Sarah to perform under circumstances where a single poor shot could cost her the entire competition. As she took her position on the 1,000-yard line, Sarah felt an unexpected calm settle over her. This was the moment her grandfather had been preparing her for without either of them knowing it. Every hour they'd spent together on Oregon hillsides, every lesson about patience and precision, every story about the importance of character under pressure had been leading to this moment. She chambered her first round and settled into her shooting position, feeling the rifle stock against her cheek and the familiar weight of the trigger under her finger. Through the scope, the distant target filled her field of view, but she could see it wavering slightly with atmospheric disturbance and her own heartbeat. Her breathing slowed to the rhythm her grandfather had taught her, and in the natural pause between breaths, Sarah squeezed the trigger. The shot felt perfect from the moment it left the barrel, and she immediately cycled the bolt for her second shot without looking for impact. The second shot felt equally good, and the third shot completed what she knew had been her best shooting of the competition. Only after all three shots were fired did Sarah look through her spotting scope to see the results. All three bullet holes were clustered in the center of the X-ring, forming a group small enough to be covered by a $50. Perfect shooting at 1,000 yards, the kind of performance that defined careers and established legends. Chun, 30 points. 3 X's. Group size, 1.2 inches. The range fell silent. 1.2 inches at 1,000 yards represented shooting that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with conventional equipment. Sarah had not just won the stage. She had set a new course record that would stand as a benchmark for future competitions. Peterson followed with his own exceptional shooting, but his 29 points weren't enough to overcome Sarah's perfect performance. When the final calculations were complete, Sarah Chun, the librarian from Oregon with her grandfather's 1943 rifle, had won the Inter-Service Marksmanship Championship by a single point. The immediate aftermath was a blur of congratulations and handshakes. Marines who had viewed her with skepticism 3 days earlier were now asking about her training methods and equipment specifications. Rodriguez was the first to congratulate her, his professional respect evident in his firm handshake and genuine smile. "That was extraordinary shooting," he said simply. "Your grandfather would be proud." Captain Williams presented Sarah with the championship trophy, a substantial piece of crystal engraved with the names of previous winners stretching back 15 years. "Ms. Chun, you've accomplished something remarkable here. You've proven that excellence in marksmanship isn't limited by background or equipment. It's determined by dedication, skill, and character under pressure." As Sarah held the trophy, she thought about her grandfather and his quiet lessons about letting your shooting speak for itself. He had taught her that the rifle was honest, that it revealed truth without pretense or politics. Today, that truth had been that a civilian woman with a vintage rifle and old-school training could outshoot the finest military marksman in the country. But more than individual victory, Sarah's performance had demonstrated something important about the nature of expertise and the value of different approaches to mastering difficult skills. The Marines' systematic, equipment-driven methodology was effective and proven. But there was room in the world for other approaches, other philosophies, other ways of achieving excellence. The victory celebration that evening brought together competitors from all branches of service and civilian backgrounds. The initial barriers between military and civilian shooters had dissolved into shared appreciation for exceptional marksmanship. Sarah found herself at the center of conversations about technique, equipment, and training methods that would have been unthinkable 3 days earlier. As the evening wound down, Sarah stepped outside onto a balcony overlooking the Pacific Ocean, still holding the trophy that represented more than just her individual achievement. Tomorrow she would return to Oregon and her quiet life among books and weekend hunting trips. But she would carry with her the knowledge that when tested against the finest marksmen in the country, the lessons her grandfather had taught her about patience, precision, and character had proven sufficient. The stars over Camp Pendleton were brilliant in the clear air, and Sarah thought about her grandfather looking up at similar stars from different battlefields in a different time. He had taught her that shooting was about more than hitting targets. It was about demonstrating what human beings could achieve when they combined skill with determination and refused to accept limitations imposed by others. Standing there with the trophy in her hands and the sound of the Pacific in her ears, Sarah Chun understood that she had honored not just her grandfather's memory, but the principles he had lived by. The rifle had indeed been honest, and it had revealed the truth that excellence belonged to those willing to pursue it regardless of their background or circumstances. The drive back to Oregon gave Sarah time to process what had happened at Camp Pendleton. The championship trophy sat in the passenger seat, wrapped carefully in her grandfather's old shooting jacket, a piece of wool that still carried the faint scent of gun oil and the outdoors. 3 days earlier, she had been an unknown librarian taking a chance on competing against military professionals. Now she was returning home as the reigning inter-service marksmanship champion, carrying with her a victory that had surprised everyone, including herself. The first sign that things had changed came at a gas station outside Sacramento. Sarah was filling her tank when a man in marine dress blues approached her car. He'd recognized her from news coverage of the competition that had begun appearing online. "Ma'am, excuse me, but are you Sarah Chen? The woman who won the shooting competition at Pendleton?" When Sarah confirmed her identity, the Marine's face broke into a grin. "Ma'am, that was incredible shooting. I'm stationed at Camp Lejeune, and word about your performance has already spread across the Corps. Beating our best shooters with a 1943 Springfield. That's legendary stuff." The encounter was the first of many that would follow Sarah home. Social media had picked up the story of the civilian woman who had outshot the Marines with her grandfather's antique rifle, and the narrative had captured public imagination in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. Videos of her shooting at the 1,000-yard line were being shared thousands of times, accompanied by commentary that ranged from technical analysis to patriotic celebration of American marksmanship tradition. When she finally pulled into her driveway in the small Oregon town where she'd lived her entire life, Sarah found her father waiting on the front porch with an expression of pride mixed with bemusement. He'd been fielding phone calls from reporters and shooting magazines all morning, trying to explain how his daughter had learned to shoot well enough to beat Marines. "Your grandfather's rifle is famous now," he said as Sarah carried her equipment into the house. "Though I suspect he would have preferred the attention go to the principles he taught rather than the rifle itself." That evening, Sarah sat in her grandfather's old study, surrounded by his hunting photographs and shooting trophies, and tried to understand what her victory meant beyond the personal satisfaction of shooting well. The phone had been ringing consistently with interview requests from outdoor magazines, invitations to shooting schools, and offers from equipment manufacturers who wanted her to endorse their products. The irony wasn't lost on her that companies were offering sponsorship deals for a shooter who had won with equipment that predated most of their corporate histories. Her grandfather's Springfield had become a symbol of something that marketing departments were eager to associate with their brands, even though its success had come precisely because it represented the opposite of modern equipment-driven approaches to shooting. The most intriguing call had come from Captain Williams, who had extended an invitation for Sarah to return to Camp Pendleton as a guest instructor for Marine marksmanship training. "Your approach to reading conditions and adapting technique in real time is something we'd like our shooters to learn," Williams had explained. "Military training emphasizes systematic consistency, but there's value in the intuitive skills you demonstrated." Sarah had asked for time to consider the offer. Teaching Marines felt like a significant responsibility, but also an opportunity to honor her grandfather's legacy by passing along the principles he had taught her. The question was whether those principles could be effectively communicated in a classroom setting or whether they required the kind of patient, individual instruction she had received over years of hunting and practice. A week after returning home, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had driven up from California on personal leave, bringing with him a proposal that would change the direction of her life in ways she hadn't considered. "I've been thinking about what happened at Pendleton," he said over coffee in Sarah's kitchen, "and I think it represents something important for the future of marksmanship training. The military approach works well for creating consistent, competent shooters, but your approach develops exceptional shooters who can adapt to any conditions." Rodriguez's idea was ambitious, a civilian marksmanship school that would combine military precision with the intuitive skills Sarah had demonstrated. It would serve both military personnel looking to improve beyond standard training and civilian shooters interested in reaching elite levels of performance. "The military has resources and systematic training methods," Rodriguez explained, "but we're limited by regulations and standardized approaches. A civilian school could experiment with different techniques, different equipment, different ways of thinking about precision shooting." The concept appealed to Sarah, but it also represented a major departure from her quiet life in Oregon. Running a shooting school would mean leaving her job at the library, investing in land and facilities, and taking on the responsibility of training others to achieve excellence in a demanding and potentially dangerous skill. That weekend, Sarah drove to the remote hunting cabin where she and her grandfather had spent countless hours practicing and learning together. The cabin sat on 40 acres of forested hills with natural shooting ranges extending to 800 yards, terrain that had shaped her understanding of how environmental conditions affected bullet flight. Walking the familiar trails, Sarah could almost hear her grandfather's voice explaining how different types of trees affected wind patterns, how humidity influenced bullet trajectory, how the angle of sunlight could affect target visibility. He had taught her that shooting was as much about understanding the natural world as it was about mechanical precision. The land would be perfect for a marksmanship school, but Sarah realized that wasn't the most important consideration. The question was whether she could teach others the lessons her grandfather had taught her, whether the principles that had made her successful could be communicated to students with different backgrounds and motivations. She spent the evening in the cabin, reading through her grandfather's journals, notebooks filled with observations about shooting technique, weather patterns, and equipment modifications. His notes were written in a mixture of English and Chinese, recording decades of careful experimentation and analysis. One entry, dated just months before his death, particularly struck her. Sarah understands that shooting is conversation between human and environment. Cannot be taught from book or classroom. Must be learned through experience and patience. But principles can be shared with those willing to listen. Reading those words, Sarah understood that her grandfather had been preparing her not just to be a good shooter, but to be a teacher of the principles that made good shooting possible. The victory at Camp Pendleton had been a test, but it had also been preparation for a larger responsibility. The next morning, Sarah called Rodriguez to accept his proposal for the marksmanship school. They would combine his military training experience with her intuitive approach to create something new in American shooting education. The school would emphasize fundamentals over equipment, adaptability over rigid doctrine, and the development of thinking shooters rather than program technicians. The announcement of the Chun Rodriguez Marksmanship Institute generated significant interest in both military and civilian shooting communities. Sarah's reputation from the Pendleton competition provided credibility, while Rodriguez's military background reassured potential students that the training would be serious and professional. The first class, scheduled for 6 months later, filled within days of registration opening. Students included Marines looking to advance their competitive shooting, police snipers seeking specialized training, and civilian marksmen interested in achieving elite-level performance. The diversity of backgrounds would test whether the teaching approach Sarah and Rodriguez were developing could work across different skill levels and objectives. Preparing for the school's opening required Sarah to analyze and articulate techniques that had previously been instinctual. Working with Rodriguez, she developed curriculum that broke down complex skills like wind reading and environmental adaptation into learnable components while maintaining the holistic understanding that her grandfather had emphasized. The process of becoming a teacher forced Sarah to understand her own shooting in new ways. She had to identify which elements of her technique were transferable and which were specific to her equipment and experience. It was challenging work that required her to think critically about assumptions she had never questioned. The media attention surrounding the school created opportunities Sarah hadn't expected. Shooting magazines wanted to profile her methods, equipment manufacturers sought her input on product development, and other shooting schools inquired about curriculum sharing arrangements. Sarah found herself becoming a spokesperson for approaches to marksmanship that emphasized skill development over equipment acquisition. The most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Chinese American Historical Society contacted Sarah about including her grandfather's story in an exhibit about Chinese military veterans who had immigrated to America. Chun Wei's journey from PLA sniper to American citizen and shooting instructor represented a unique chapter in immigrant history that deserved preservation. Working with the Historical Society, Sarah learned details about her grandfather's military service that he had never shared with his family. He had been part of elite sniper units during the Chinese Civil War and Korean conflict, achieving recognition for exceptional marksmanship under combat conditions. His immigration to America had required leaving behind not just his homeland, but also a military career that had defined his identity. Understanding her grandfather's sacrifices gave new meaning to Sarah's own success. Her victory at Camp Pendleton had validated not just her individual skills, but the value of knowledge and traditions that immigrants brought to America. The principles her grandfather had taught her were rooted in military experience gained in conflicts most Americans knew little about. Yet those principles had proven effective against the finest American marksmen. As the opening of the marksmanship school approached, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from anonymous librarian to recognized shooting instructor. The transformation had begun with a simple decision to accept an invitation to compete at Camp Pendleton, but it had been guided by principles her grandfather had instilled in her years earlier. The night before the first class was scheduled to begin, Sarah sat in her grandfather's study with the championship trophy and his journals, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with carrying forward his legacy. Teaching others to shoot well was important, but teaching them to understand the deeper principles that made shooting well possible was a greater challenge. Her grandfather had always said that the rifle was honest, revealing truth without pretense or politics. Now Sarah would discover whether she could help others learn to hear that truth and respond to it with the skill and character that defined exceptional marksmanship. The success of the school would determine whether the lessons of one Chinese sniper could influence a new generation of American shooters, creating ripples that would extend far beyond the ranges where bullets found their targets. The Chin Rodriguez Marksmanship Institute opened on a crisp October morning with 12 students gathered at the Oregon facility that had once been Sarah's private refuge. The converted hunting cabin now housed classrooms and equipment storage, while the natural shooting ranges had been developed into professional training facilities extending from 100 to 1,000 yards. Sarah stood before her first class, looking out at faces that represented the diversity of American marksmanship. Marines seeking advanced training, police officers improving their skills, and civilian shooters pursuing excellence. Before we talk about shooting, Sarah began, I want you to understand what you're really here to learn. My grandfather used to say that the rifle is honest. It reveals truth about your preparation, your technique, and your character under pressure. Over the next 5 days, we're going to explore what that truth means and how you can learn to hear it clearly. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had taken leave from the Marines to co-teach the inaugural class, bringing military systematic training methods that would complement Sarah's intuitive approach. The combination proved powerful from the first morning, as students experienced structured skill-building exercises followed by environmental challenge sessions that forced them to adapt their techniques in real time. The first major test came on day 3, when Sarah introduced her grandfather's concept of shooting conversation, the idea that successful marksmanship required ongoing communication between shooter, rifle, and environment. Students were taken to unmarked positions throughout the property and asked to engage targets at unknown distances in varying wind conditions, using only their ability to read environmental cues. Master Sergeant Williams, a Marine sniper with 2 combat deployments, struggled initially with the exercise. His military training had emphasized precise calculations and systematic adjustments, but Sarah's approach required trusting instincts and making real-time adaptations based on subtle environmental feedback. I keep trying to calculate exact wind speed and direction, Williams confided during a break. But you're asking me to feel the wind instead of measure it. Calculations matter, Sarah replied. But they're based on static conditions that rarely exist in the real world. Your body can sense changes faster than your mind can calculate them, but only if you learn to trust what your senses are telling you. The breakthrough came when Williams stopped trying to impose systematic solutions on dynamic problems and started responding to what each shot taught him about current conditions. His groups tightened dramatically, and, more importantly, his shooting became consistent across varying environmental challenges. Detective Patricia Chun, no relation to Sarah, had come to the school from the Los Angeles Police Department's SWAT team. Her shooting was technically proficient, but lacked the confidence needed for exceptional performance under pressure. Sarah recognized the symptoms of a shooter who had been trained to doubt herself and seek external validation for every decision. Your technique is solid, Sarah told her after watching her struggle with a 600-yard shot, but you're shooting to avoid mistakes instead of shooting to achieve excellence. Those are different mindsets that produce different results. Working individually with Detective Chun, Sarah shared lessons her grandfather had taught about the mental aspects of precision shooting. Fear of failure created tension that disrupted the natural rhythm of good shooting, while focus on process rather than outcome allowed skills to function automatically under stress. The transformation was remarkable, as Detective Chun learned to trust her preparation and shoot with confidence rather than hesitation. Her accuracy improved dramatically. More importantly, she developed the kind of composure that would serve her well in the high-stress situations police snipers faced. The civilian students presented different challenges and opportunities. Robert Martinez, a competitive shooter from Texas, had come seeking techniques that would give him an edge in national championships. His equipment was cutting-edge and his technical knowledge extensive, but his shooting lacked the adaptability that separated good competitors from champions. You shoot like someone who expects perfect conditions, Sarah observed after watching Martinez struggle when wind patterns shifted during a string of shots. But competition conditions are never perfect. The shooter who adapts best usually wins, not the one with the most precise calculations. Working with Martinez, Rodriguez demonstrated military techniques for rapid environmental assessment and adjustment, while Sarah taught the intuitive skills needed to stay ahead of changing conditions. The combination gave Martinez tools he had never developed despite years of competition experience. The most challenging student was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a trauma surgeon who had taken up long-range shooting as a stress relief hobby. Her medical training had given her excellent hand-eye coordination and the ability to work under pressure, but she approached shooting with the same analytical mindset she used in surgery, seeking to control every variable rather than adapting to conditions beyond her influence. Surgery requires you to impose order on chaos, Sarah explained during a one-on-one session. But shooting requires you to find order within chaos that already exists. You can't control the wind or eliminate all variables, but you can learn to work with them instead of fighting them. The lesson resonated with Dr. Walsh, who began to understand that marksmanship required a different type of precision than she was accustomed to. Her shooting improved as she learned to accept uncertainty and make decisions based on incomplete information, skills that ultimately made her better in both shooting and medical practice. By the fourth day, the class had developed into a cohesive group united by shared challenge and mutual respect. Military and civilian students were learning from each other, discovering that excellence in marksmanship could emerge from different backgrounds and approaches. The camaraderie that developed reminded Sarah of the atmosphere at Camp Pendleton, where initial skepticism had given way to professional appreciation. The final day featured a comprehensive test that would challenge every skill the students had developed. Sarah and Rodriguez had designed a course that required engaging multiple targets at various distances under time pressure, simulating the kind of complex scenarios where marksmanship training proved its real-world value. Master Sergeant Williams dominated the military precision portions, but struggled with adaptability challenges. Detective Chun excelled under pressure, but found pure accuracy tests demanding. Martinez showed dramatic improvement in variable conditions, while Dr. Walsh surprised everyone with her overall consistency. Each student had developed strengths while identifying areas for continued growth. The graduation ceremony was held on the range where Sarah had first learned to shoot with her grandfather. As she presented certificates to the 12 students, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since her victory at Camp Pendleton just 8 months earlier. The quiet librarian who had surprised Marines with her shooting had become a teacher whose influence would extend through dozens of students who would carry her grandfather's principles into their own careers and communities. What you've learned here isn't just about shooting, Sarah told the graduating class. You've learned approaches to excellence that apply to any demanding skill. You've discovered that achievement comes from combining systematic preparation with adaptive thinking, that confidence grows from competence earned through honest practice, and that true expertise requires understanding principles rather than just following procedures. The success of the first class generated immediate demand for additional programs. The school's calendar filled with advanced courses, specialized training for military units, and programs designed for specific shooting disciplines. Sarah found herself traveling to teach at other facilities while expanding the Oregon campus to accommodate growing demand. The most satisfying development was the network of former students who stayed in touch, sharing their continued progress and seeking guidance on advanced challenges. Master Sergeant Williams wrote from Afghanistan, where techniques learned at the school had proven valuable in combat conditions. Detective Chun had been promoted to SWAT team leader, partly based on shooting skills that had improved dramatically after her training. Martinez had won his first national championship, crediting the adaptability skills he'd learned for his success in difficult conditions. Dr. Walsh had perhaps the most unexpected outcome. The mental disciplines she'd learned for marksmanship had improved her surgical performance under stress, leading to recognition from her hospital's trauma department. She had become an advocate for precision training as a way to develop general performance skills applicable across professional fields. A year after the school's opening, Sarah received an invitation that brought her story full circle. The Marines wanted her to return to Camp Pendleton as the keynote speaker for their annual Marksmanship Awards ceremony. Captain Williams, now promoted to Major, extended the invitation personally. "Your victory here changed how we think about marksmanship training," Williams explained. "But, more than that, your approach has influenced our understanding of how to develop adaptable leaders who can perform under uncertainty. We'd like you to share those insights with our next generation of Marines." Standing at the podium in the same base theater where she had received her competition briefing 2 years earlier, Sarah looked out at an audience of Marines Navy SEALs, Army snipers, and distinguished guests. The woman who had once felt like an outsider observing alien military culture now understood that she had helped bridge the gap between different approaches to achieving excellence. 2 years ago, I came here as a civilian competitor with an old rifle and unconventional training, Sarah began. I left as the champion, but, more importantly, I left with an understanding that excellence has many forms. Military systematic training produces consistent, competent performers. But there's also room for approaches that emphasize adaptability, intuition, and the kind of deep understanding that comes from patient practice over many years. She told them about her grandfather's journey from Chinese sniper to American shooting instructor, how principles developed in one context had proven valuable in completely different circumstances. She explained how the shooting school was creating bridges between military and civilian marksmanship communities, sharing knowledge that made everyone better. The rifle is honest, Sarah concluded, echoing her grandfather's favorite saying. It reveals truth about our preparation, our skills, and our character. But it also reveals truth about our capacity to learn from each other, to grow through challenge, and to achieve excellence regardless of our background or circumstances. That's a truth worth pursuing, whether you're shooting at targets or pursuing any other demanding goal. The standing ovation that followed felt like recognition not just of Sarah's achievements, but of the principles her grandfather had lived by and passed on. In the audience, she spotted Rodriguez, now teaching marksmanship at Marine sniper schools throughout the country, and several of her former students who had come to witness her return to where it all began. After the ceremony, Sarah walked alone to the 1,000-yard range where she had fired the shots that changed her life. The Pacific breeze was blowing again, creating the kind of challenging conditions that had tested shooters for generations. She thought about her grandfather, who would have been amazed to see how far his quiet lessons had traveled, how many lives they had touched, how much difference one person's dedication to excellence could make. The championship trophy sat in her study back in Oregon, but Sarah understood now that the real victory wasn't about winning a competition. It was about proving that principles mattered more than background, that excellence could emerge from unexpected sources, and that the honest conversation between shooter and rifle could teach lessons that extended far beyond the boundaries of any range. Her grandfather had been right. The rifle was honest. And in learning to hear its truth clearly, Sarah had discovered not just how to shoot well, but how to live well, how to teach others, and how to honor the past while building something meaningful for the future. The bullets had told their truth, and that truth had changed everything.